What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Now, this comes after beating the entire game because Owlcat Games actually reached out about a week and a half ago from the time of this video to offer me the full release build of the game so I could do a review, which should be launching, of course, today, the day before the game itself actually launches. So a couple of things. One, this will be my initial review. I absolutely still plan on doing my normal review after 100% for the game like I do with everything, but given the obviously unique opportunity this presented, I wanted to go ahead and do this so I could share my experiences with the full game and address some of the questions and things I've gotten as I've been covering this game since the beta launched all the way back in February. Now, I do plan on keeping this as spoiler-free as I can, so while I will be talking about systems and things and potentially how those systems interact with the story, obviously I'm going to try to avoid the story in its entirety outside of what the marketing would have mentioned. So, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is a isometric CRPG from, of course, Owlcat Games. The combat is real-time with pause normally, however there is a turn-based mode that will launch with the game, so you can do turn-based or real-time with pause. Now, I do want to mention that this game is separate from Kingmaker in the sense that outside of its developer and the systems, of course, because they use the same engine and stuff from one game to the next, the games beyond that aren't particularly connected. This is because Pathfinder publishes what are called Adventure Paths, which is a series of 6 books that take a character from level 0 to level 20, and in this case, also give you the option of Mythic Paths, which we'll get into in a bit. Basically, these adventure paths, while all taking place in the same universe, of course, are largely separate. Thus, Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous don't have much to do with each other outside of some characters and NPCs returning. Beyond that, I want to mention that when it comes to their engine and systems and stuff that they used for this game, there are just tons of improvements. The UI is just a straight-up improvement over Kingmaker. It's a lot better in a lot of ways, mostly in the way it conveys information in a much more clear manner that I think is going to help people out a lot, so kudos to them there. And a lot of other improvements to just, systems being expanded upon, like how you can craft scrolls and brew potions and things while you rest now. Camp supplies has been replaced with a corruption mechanic, things like that. So I do want to mention, while I'm going to be covering, obviously, quite a bit here, that there are a ton of little things that are hard to nail down in any one particular section of this. So I just wanted to mention across the board, there are just tons of little improvements from Kingmaker. For instance, being able to rotate the camera 360 degrees as opposed to the static view. So let's actually jump into some other stuff here. Character creation. They have added several more classes. I believe the total is 25 base classes. They added more archetypes, which for the D&D crowd is more like subclasses, though they do function a bit differently than subclasses. That is the closest comparison I can make. It's a subtype of a base class. They also have a number of pre-generated characters for you to choose from if making a character is a little daunting for you, because I believe it will be just that for newcomers. There are so many options in character creation, and if you're just coming to the game for the first time, that's going to be quite a lot to take in all at once. And if you need some help with that, I've got tons of videos on how each and every one of these classes actually works, how prestige classes work, all that stuff, but it is just a lot for new players. However, personally, as someone who plays CRPGs all the time, I absolutely love this character creation system myself. There's so many choices. Some of it does overlap. I can see where someone might say some of this seems kind of redundant because, yeah, sure, some of it probably is. Beyond that, when it comes to starting a new game, we also have the difficulty options. These range from story mode to unfair. I do want to mention that in story mode, you can still, get a game over. Your characters can still die. Like, if your party gets wiped out, then you still get a game over. Like, there's no god mode or anything that gets turned on for story mode. It's just much easier combat-wise, but you can still lose. And the other end of the spectrum is, of course, unfair difficulty, which is just that. It's quite literally unfair. So enemies will be given tons of bonuses and stuff, and you very much so need to know exactly what you're doing to tackle unfair. Because when I did my review on Kingmaker, after 100%ing it, thus requiring an unfair playthrough, it was very difficult. The unfair truly lives up to its name. A lot of times combat can come down to whether or not you got the dice rolls you needed to get, kind of thing. Now, in addition to those things, before we jump into talking about combat a bit, I want to talk about the Mythic Paths. Honestly, I think Mythic Paths are probably going to be the main selling point of this game because they allow you to turn into something greater than a mortal being. And that comes with tons of power and more character options to build your character with. So when it comes to Mythic Paths, I will have a separate video probably up tomorrow about the launch version of the Mythic Paths system. However, I do have a video up already from the time this video will launch talking about the Mythic Paths, but just to give a quick explanation, your character is going to encounter mythic power, basically, and be imbued with power beyond what a mortal could normally take. And eventually, this will allow you to ascend to different mythic paths, which can be things like a demon, an aeon, an angel, a lich even, all of which come with unique powers and abilities and options through the game. Now, if you're curious about how each of these individual options works, again, I have videos for all of the beta stuff that was in the beta already made. You can check those out. I will actually also, hopefully tomorrow, have more answers for some of the things that were not in the beta that I can't show you today, frankly. But essentially, as the game progresses through use of a milestone system, meaning that once you reach certain points in the game, your mythic level will grow. It is 1 through 10. At 3, you get to choose your initial pick, and then there are other options late game, so some of the mythic paths become available for you later, such as the Gold Dragon, the Swarm That Walks, or the Legend mythic path. Those are late game paths, and you'll choose an initial one at 3, and it's possible for that to change way later in the game, at least into one of the late game paths. You can't, for instance, change from one early game path to another early game path. But again, tons of power and options. They really dove into the class fantasy, so to speak, of a lot of these. So for Lich, you'll be able to actually get a few extra companions by raising them from the dead. You also get an undead skeleton pet that functions the way the rest of the game's animal companions do. Demons get a demonic rage. They get all sorts of various demons they can turn into and aspects of demons they can activate. There are usually spellbooks associated with mythic paths, meaning that each mythic path will usually get a set of spells. Some of these work in conjunction with the base class that you have spellbook, and when you take those mythic paths, sometimes they will combine that spellbook. And typically speaking, all of your regular mythic spellbooks will scale off of your mythic level, whereas if you combine it with your regular spellbook, it works off of whatever your class works off of. But my point being that these mythic paths really, really exponentially change the amount of options and things available to a character to have fun and advance with. And again, they're probably the main draw of the game, and they greatly impact the story as well as the Crusade. Because the other half of the big draw of this game is the Crusade system. This is replacing kingdom management, but basically, as the marketing will have told us, we are going to be leading the 5th Crusade against the demons of the World Wound. Now, overall, I like this a lot more than the kingdom management system in Pathfinder, because I didn't like that system at all. Now, that said, the Crusade system, it still has its pain points and bugs. I just want to mention that a lot of the bugs I encountered were with the Crusade system. Like, for instance, killing summoned units from a unit that can summon them. If I kill the summoned unit first, for whatever reason, that would just hardlock a lot of the battles for me. And just little stuff like that. However, a lot of that can be mitigated by turning on auto mode for the Crusade. Because turning on auto mode takes care of the strategic half, because the Crusade is largely split into 2 halves. The battling portion, where you control armies and fight battles in a Heroes of Might and Magic style manner. And then there's the other half where you're actually managing the Crusade. This allows you to build outposts from conquered demon outposts and customize the buildings and things like you could in Kingmaker. And this will give your troops and your armies various bonuses as well as recruitment options. And again, these things are influenced by your mythic path, because you can potentially, even depending on your mythic path, recruit enemies that would not be normal for an army. So a demon will be able to recruit some demons even. And just kind of all various things that relate back to your mythic path, which adds a decent amount to the replayability of this game. But as I mentioned, you can turn auto mode on for the strategic half, and then it'll handle basically everything for you as far as like the armies and stuff go, so you don't have to be nearly as involved as the kingdom management system, which was incredibly tedious. And on that note, the timers that came with the kingdom management have largely been removed. There are things that are timed in this game, however, for starters, they're very clearly telegraphed. In your journal, it will show you red hourglasses next to the quests that have to be completed by the end of that chapter. There's no time limit to doing them normally outside of do them before you finish that chapter of the game. Moreover, oftentimes when you hit like the point of no return, so to speak, for a chapter, the game will often very clearly tell you, hey, if you progress past this point, quests and things you haven't finished will fail. which is much appreciated because Kingmaker was very horrible at not doing that. And it was very easy to mess up a lot of stuff, even though you didn't technically do anything wrong, per se. So let's talk combat a little bit. Combat is, again, turn-based or real-time with pause. It is, of course, the Pathfinder system. I believe it is based primarily off the first edition, though they have taken some things from the second edition of the game, which is out, but primarily first edition. Personally, I like it. It's a lot of fun, especially with the Mythic Paths stuff. There's a lot more powers and stuff for you to play around with, a lot more classes, adding a lot of variety to the combat. I do want to mention that they added things like mounted combat with this as well. The problem with that is a lot of your fighting takes place in cramped quarters, which means mounted combat can feel a little hard to pull off. Because of those cramped spaces, sometimes you can summon things and enemies will turn into things that are gigantic, and sometimes it feels like you don't have enough space for the fights, which can be a bit of a problem. That occurs mostly late game. It's not so bad early game. But I just want to mention that late game that does kind of become a little bit of a problem. But outside of that, very cool, very Pathfinder. Decent amount of enemy variety, and again, you're going to be fighting all sorts of demons and stuff as you crusade against the demons of the Worldwound. Visually, very cool. My only complaint, again, as I mentioned, is that things towards the end get incredibly large, which makes actually seeing what's going on and managing your characters a little more difficult than I feel like it should be, because all these large creatures on the screen make it hard to see your characters, which, depending on the situation, are going to be smaller than, typically speaking, the enemies you're fighting. So that can be a bit of a pain point, but otherwise very fun. Now let's talk companions. So companions are one thing I rarely agree with my audience on. However, I'm not going to talk too much about the individual companions themselves. I'll have a video up tomorrow about that, actually, kind of giving an update on companions since the last time I made a companions video for the game, which has been quite a while. Because they fixed a lot of the little things. For instance, Arushale, who is actually a succubus companion you can get, was labeled as a tiefling. They fixed that so it actually shows that she's a succubus in the menu, for instance, now. And just little things like that have been corrected is what I'm talking about, which is nice to see. Now, the companions themselves, not going to get into their personality and stuff, but I did want to say this. Their quests are really cool. They did a lot of cool stuff with the companion quests that I wasn't expecting, and some of them take some pretty dark and unexpected turns. And again, I just had a lot of fun with the companion quests, and as someone who reviews games, I want to mention this. Companions are one thing that I find particularly tricky to talk about, because a lot of what comes down to whether or not you like the companions and whether or not they're interesting is ultimately just that, personal taste, right? Now, as a reviewer, my goal is generally this when it comes to companions. Regardless of whether or not I like that person individually, do they have some amount of character development and do they have an interesting quest? Those are the things that I look at, because if I personally don't like a companion, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad character. And someone out there probably will like that companion. So when I convey these things, what I like to talk about is whether or not that person, again, had any character development, like you see their character arc change or, be influenced by you in some way even. And do they have interesting and unique quests? And I can check all of that off for basically every single one of these companions. A lot of them had things I did not expect going on at all. Things took twists that I didn't expect at all. And a lot of them have that character development. And I would say a couple of them remain basically the same person as when I met them. But overall, they definitely change and grow with you, and they do react to the things you do in terms of like your mythic path. So, as you might imagine, the lawful good paladin, Sila, is not a big fan of you turning into a demon and then using a demon army to fight the Worldwound. They still stick to their principles, and a lot of them can leave you. They do interact with each other around the campfire and stuff, so it's just a lot of fun. I like the companions, is my point. So to wrap this up, I want to talk about some highlights and some negatives, and then just kind of a recommendation in general. So the highlights of this game, for me, are this. The Mythic Paths are super cool. They included some surprises, some stuff I don't want to talk about here for the sake of spoilers, actually, and I will make separate videos and things for those later anyway. But the Mythic Paths are just really cool. And again, there's some surprises later I wasn't expecting that I think really add a lot to the experience. They did a really good job with the Mythic Path system. I also wanted to mention that they made use of the new tech that they were using very much. So for instance, there's this one part of the game where you have to rotate the camera and look a certain way for the map to then move, and then you can carry on forward. So they use their new 360 camera to their advantage because, again, in some places in the game, turning your camera a certain way will cause literally the entire map to shift, which then creates a way forward for you, which I thought was a really cool mechanic. And it's only really used in like one chapter of the game, so they didn't overdo it. The game itself is just very ambitious, and it mostly succeeds on that. There are, again, a few pain points. Some of the Crusade doesn't work as well as I would like it to, and I did run into a few bugs that made certain quests uncompletable, though nothing game-breaking. Again, considering how very ambitious this title is and how all of these Mythic Paths and the Crusade system combine to give each person who plays this a fairly unique experience, I imagine, it's just really cool to see. Because of that, it's really cool seeing the outcome of all of your choices and stuff at the end of the game and kind of how that stuff takes effect. I had a lot of fun just watching how I chose to play the game and address situations I hadn't seen in the beta, then all culminate in the finale, so to speak. Again, just very well done. Very cool. And lastly, in the highlights section, mounted combat is really cool mechanically. I just wish they had given you more open space to use it better. Because again, a lot of the places you're fighting in are actually fairly cramped. There's only a few maps in the game that are like open enough to really enjoy the mounted combat. Again, while it's a really cool addition to the game, it's just hard to get into it because all the spaces are so cramped. It's hard to use like the charges and stuff that would make it more fun. Now, let's talk negatives before we wrap this bad boy up. So for starters, bugs. I didn't run into anything game-breaking personally. However, I did run into some serious bugs. As I mentioned, I ran into some bugs that prevented me from completing quests, which means I had to just take the outcome of that as is. So it is unfortunate that bugs like that exist. Now, that said, compared to the launch of Kingmaker and how all of the weaving arcs of this game combine, I'm not terribly surprised about these bugs. It's just disappointing to see some of them completely block off a quest from being completed. Again, nothing that stopped me from completing the game, but some of my options were basically forced because I couldn't go do certain quests because of a bug. So that could be pretty annoying. Another negative is the demon fights get a little old. A lot of the monsters get repetitive. At the end of the game, like every monster that you're fighting, a lot of these demons get like just comically big, to the point where it's like you can't even see your characters on the battlefield to give them directions. It made me laugh, but it's obviously a negative because it's going to make handling combat difficult. Because again, all of these demons, they become the size of several houses, and it's like how, like I can't even see my guys, and it gets kind of ridiculous. So mostly a late game problem, like probably 3/4 of the way through the game that starts to happen, and it can be an issue for sure. The other negative, the Crusade system bugs are again annoying, just like the regular games. So having to constantly reload the fights for the Crusade system because my characters can't end their turn because of the bug, that can be annoying. Again, nothing game breaking, just annoying. But with all of that stuff out of the way, let's draw a conclusion for this game. So for starters, $50 game. This is not a full price game. It's $50. So right there already gets some praise. That said, I would have gladly paid $60 for this. It is well worth it. There is a lot to love here. There are definitely some faults, but just by and large, this is just a flat improvement from Kingmaker. I enjoy this game much more on a mechanical level, on a UI level. They made so many improvements from Kingmaker that's hard to ignore. So the occasional frustrating bug aside, this is well worth the money, especially $50. Couldn't recommend the game more. I hope you guys enjoy it and have a ton of fun with it. So with all that out of the way, guys, truly, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. You guys watching is what allows me to make videos like this and get games ahead of time to review them for you. So truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.